All right, ladies, gentlemen, welcome to the post Memorial Day Tuesday edition of the MSP Initiative. Happy to be joined today by a good friend in the IT circles, if you would, Joe Landis from Nerdio. Joe, where you at today, man?
Today, George, I am in Staten Island, New York.
Is the ferry still running?
That's a great question. I don't know if the ferry's still running. I'm thinking it probably is, but maybe on limited hours, or maybe they shut it down. I really don't know. Maybe actually, the more I think about it, maybe it is shut down. Well, I'll have to check.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's got to be what, four people on it? I mean, can't
Yeah.
be too much traffic, right?
I had never been on the Staten Island ferry until I married my wife, and she's like, "Well, I live in Staten Island." I'm like, well, where's Staten Island exactly? So I had to do a little research, and then I remember this thing called the Staten Island Ferry. First time I went on it, I loved it. Looking out, you see the Statue of Liberty. It's just very cool. But nobody else on the boat seemed as excited as I was, because I think they sort of take it every day, and it's kind of
Yeah,
regular.
I guess the Statue of Liberty is cool, but when you're passing it every day, it's
Right.
like, oh, hey, what's up?
Yeah, exactly.
I remember the Statue of Liberty when you could still go up.
Yeah. I've never been out there to visit. I'd like to do it though one time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if they even allow that anymore. Like you can go on the island and kind of check it out, but you can't necessarily
Go up.
yeah, which is a shame. I guess, security is different, right?
Right. Exactly.
So you're kind of near me to a degree, right? I'm based here out of Philadelphia Metro, and of course, when the New Jersey Turnpike isn't all that jammed, it's not too bad.
I know, right up the turnpike from each other. It'd be today in a sort of a different kind of day than we're used to outside of the 3 months that we've been having. We could get
I
each other pretty fast today, I bet.
I know. I was actually just telling a few people that like the weather's finally starting to kind of get nice, like 70s, 80s.
Yeah,
And I argued that the weather kept more people inside on the lockdown than the lockdown did.
it did. You're right. Now it's nice. The windows are open in the room here, and enjoying being on one webinar, one podcast after the next. It's been great.
Yeah, lots of back-to-back ones, right?
Yeah, people talk about webinar fatigue, and I say, you don't feel fatigue if they're interesting. If they're not interesting, you definitely feel some fatigue, right?
Yeah, that's why the recycling bins that get picked up before the trash cans now.
Aha, that's a good one. That's right. But I never thought of that one. That's good.
It's the truth. I started seeing the recycle. You never see the recycling can gone before the trash can. Now it's the reverse.
It is the reverse. There were many days here, though, in New York at the beginning of the pandemic that we had no idea when any of that was going to get picked up. We'd put it out and it would sit there for days, and then sort of in the middle of the night, someone would come by and pick it up. But now it's getting back to normal, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, listen, it's been an interesting time over the last couple of months now. I mean, I'm not sure when New York proper totally opens back up. I'm hearing August. But bottom line is, I think we've all heard the war stories by now of people trying to figure out how to get people to work remotely, and all the duct tape and bubble gum and band-aiding that was done, or quick, I don't know how many migrations you could do on the fly. But there was just a lot of like ebb and flow, right? However they could get it done. And I would argue that your background, kind of helps a different angle of things, right? So why don't you tell the crowd your professional history? How did you get to Nerdio? And like, just so that they understand your background.
Absolutely. So I worked at Microsoft for 23 years, George. I like to say that I worked for all three CEOs, for Bill, Steve, and Satya. Three totally different CEOs, right? And probably we could have a podcast just about that. So the last almost 10 years of my time at Microsoft, I was pretty deep into the Azure ecosystem, the Microsoft Azure cloud ecosystem. And I was based abroad. I spent most of the end of my career at Microsoft living in India, in Brazil, in Russia, Czech Republic, and Germany. So I was leading sales and marketing teams outside the US.
Your passport's nuclear, man.
It is. So I went to Microsoft's yearly partner conference called Microsoft Inspire. And I was walking around Microsoft Inspire, and I saw this booth that said Nerdio. I said, wow, that's an interesting name. Let me see what they do. And as it turns out, I learned at the time that Nerdio is really deep into the Azure ecosystem, and helps to solve a problem that I was struggling with at Microsoft for a very long time. How do you bring more small and medium businesses to the cloud with Azure? And I can humbly say I was not doing a great job of that piece in my different sales roles at Microsoft. But when I saw what Nerdio had, I said, wow, we need to bring this into Microsoft somehow. We need to introduce this tool to other countries, to other parts of the world. Long story short, the CEO, Vadim Vladimirsky of Nerdio, had a different idea. He called me up after we met. He said, hey, we're looking for a chief revenue officer. Would you be interested in leaving Microsoft to come to Nerdio? Quite frankly,
all that time. Oh,
yeah. So exactly. Quite frankly, I never thought of leaving Microsoft. I thought they would carry me out, in my 70s or 80s or whatever. But I decided to take the plunge to work at a startup, a real startup. And I remember the day going into my boss saying, his name is Joel Shalaby. Hey, Joel, I just want to let you know I'm going to be leaving Microsoft to work for Nerdio. And he thought something was wrong with me. He didn't understand what I was talking about. You can imagine my parents, they thought I was sick. They didn't know, they had to fly out to Seattle to come get me. But I tell you, it's been great. And why? Because we're at such an unbelievable opportunity with the technology we have to empower MSPs to build successful cloud practices in Azure. Most MSPs have taken the leap to the cloud with Office 365, now actually renamed by Microsoft 365, if you want to get confused.
I feel like they did that at the worst time, but
yeah, they did, right. So most MSPs, like 85, 90% of MSPs, have already moved to the cloud from a SaaS perspective. But probably only a couple percent have done that from an IaaS perspective, from an infrastructure perspective. By the way, there's someone who's enjoying the day outside. He just goes up and back on his motorcycle nonstop. So you get a little bit of background for your.
Somebody was bored out in Staten Island.
Someone's bored, and there's no cars, so I guess he could just do that and do wheelies. But most MSPs have not moved to the cloud with their infrastructure, and that's where we come in at Nerdio. We empower them to do that. We have the tools to allow them to do that, and we could talk more about what we have.
Let's zoom out on that for a second, because I think you hit on a couple of points, and it's worth kind of getting a little bit deeper. So I mean, listen, Office 365 was originally what Microsoft BPOS, Business Productivity Suite, right? I remember I was back then. Yeah, I was still doing this back then, and like they realized that was a really bad marketing name. And they were like, oh, let's make Office 365 and get everybody off of these small business servers, Exchange servers. Like I would cringe when I'd hear on-prem Exchange, right? I'd just go like, hey, how do we get rid of this, right? And there was a lot of early pioneers in the hosted Exchange world, right? And people who weren't Microsoft took that and tried to like make it work. Give me your opinion real quick on like, you said you've been through multiple CEOs. They've all had different mandates. Like, how did we get from the mid 2000s with BPOS to Microsoft 365 now? Like, what's the vision change that got us here?
Well, I think certainly when Satya Nadella came in to become the CEO of Microsoft, he had this concept of, at first he called it mobile first, cloud first. Then the mobile piece it moved away, or it went a little, let's say, backstage for a bit. And with Satya, everything is about the cloud. Every product Microsoft has is about the cloud. Every motion they do, every sales motion, marketing motion, even something like you take Xbox, right? You think, well, what does Xbox have to do with the cloud? Well, first of all, Xbox has tens of millions of people using their Xbox Live in Azure in the cloud. They have a subscription service for games on Xbox, right, that you can use that's in the cloud. So everything became cloud. So, you talk about this horrific idea of continuing to run an Exchange server. It's true. No MSP wants to run an Exchange server anymore. They'd much rather run Office in the cloud and have all the updates and the latest bits. And it's just much easier. It's so much more palatable to do. But, I think that change, that new way of thinking is starting to hit now on the infrastructure side as much as the same way as now Microsoft 365. And the issue though is that it's much more complicated. More MSPs can kind of get their heads around the concept of running apps in the cloud, like, SharePoint, Teams, Word, Excel, all those different apps are used to. It's much harder for MSPs to get their head around the notion of, I'm going to take my customer's server that has their Active Directory and storage, file servers, and just rip it out, use it as a boat anchor or whatever they want to use it for now, and move all of that to the cloud.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a second on that. So, all right, we know that Office 365, Microsoft 365, whatever you want to call the new branding. I think it'll take time for the new SKU names to all filter through. Like, fairly straightforward though, right? So, like, you know what your price is, and unless you need a reason to upgrade to a higher tier, it is what it is, right? Unless Microsoft shows up one day and says, hey, we're raising the price on you, which hasn't happened all too much. I mean, people pretty much know what their price is going to be. Now we kind of pivot to not just Azure, right? Like, there's Google, there's Amazon, there's Azure. There's, like, some more MSP direct companies like Green Cloud and a couple of those guys. So, like, I think the biggest concern, and this doesn't shock you, but I'm gonna put it out there first foot. How do I know what my price is going to be? Isn't that not the single hardest situation when you're talking about moving infrastructure from dedicated machines or flat rate functionality to, it's metered, right? Based on usage and storage, and, like, isn't that the scariest part of this whole story?
Well, first of all, George, little you say shocks me anymore. I'll start with that.
Okay.
But you're right. That is one of the biggest barriers for an MSP moving to the cloud with Azure, is understanding the pricing and being able to take what is typically viewed as a variable cost structure using a utility, a public utility like Azure, and crafting it in a fixed cost way so that you can go to a customer and say, it's going to cost you $140 a user a month. You're going to get everything you need. Your user is going to have a virtual desktop with all the storage they need. It's going to run fast. That is very hard for MSPs to get their head around. And that's where we at Nerdio really help them be able to build out. There's one thing is building the infrastructure out for the customer, which we do, and our technology enables that. It's a different thing to teach people how to build a cloud practice from a business standpoint. Mm-hmm. What should something cost? How much do you charge? What do you really need? It's much, much harder. And it is, as you say, George, what stops most MSPs from moving to the cloud is because they say, I cannot figure out how to make money in the cloud. Whenever I look at Azure, it seems too expensive to me. And we actually give a very popular class called Demystifying Azure for MSPs, where we actually go through a section on how to make a lot of money selling Microsoft Azure for MSPs.
So so the pricing component, right? Because there's reserved instances, there's termed, pricing, there's spot instances, right? There's all these new concepts, right? That's number one. The pricing we talked about, all of this changes how that math works.
Yep.
And then the other concern is, really, the workload experience, right? Like, Microsoft's rolled out their own virtual desktop program. Is that different? Is that part of this? And then how do I take a server that's been running the way it's been running forever, who knows, however long, and say, hey, I'm going to move this and still have it run well, right? That's the other half of the problem, right? How do I make sure that by moving this, I'm actually still maintaining or enhancing the actual end user's experience?
Yeah. So, wow, lots of different topics you raised there. First of all, I'd say on the pricing side, we have something called the Nerdio Cost Estimator. And what the cost estimator does is it allows you to take your on-premises or even a different cloud infrastructure, plug it into our tool, and out the other end, it's like a wizard that you go through, and out the other end spits out your per user per month cost to get all of the resources you need to move to the cloud. Your Azure, your Microsoft 365, your Nerdio piece, your Windows 10 Enterprise if you need that, everything you need. So you as an MSP now feel incredibly confident that if it spits out $51 a user a month, that you could put your managed services on top of it, your BVoIP on top of it, your VCIO, your help desk, and your margin.
So how close is it, right? Because
very, very accurate, because we are tied in via APIs to the Microsoft calculator, to the Azure calculator. The other thing we do, George, is we don't just give you the price, we architect the solution for you. So when you have to go buy Azure, what does it mean to buy Azure? Typically what most MSPs who are probably listening to this recording say is they say, okay, I'm working with, let's say, Pax8. I'm going to go to Pax8, and what do you need to buy? You need to buy something called an Azure subscription and a Microsoft 365 subscription. When you buy an Azure subscription, you have to think of it as like a, like an empty water bottle, right? And you have to fill the subscription with resources, with Azure resources. And that's what allows you to bring your customer to Azure. The question is, what resources do I put in my subscription? And that's where we help you at Nerdio. We architect the solution for you. We tell you what it's going to cost. So now you could go to Pax8 and say, I need these virtual machines, this number of cores, this much memory. So you can do what you said before, George. You could mimic and match and even enhance what is running on premises in the cloud.
Okay, so let's say all that magic you just said works exactly as advertised, and
always
just wave the wand. Okay, yeah. Isn't bandwidth a concern? Like, isn't your customer's pipe literally the Achilles heel to this whole story?
It could be. We certainly run into MSPs that live in very remote areas where bandwidth is not necessarily great. I always say, George, it has a lot to do with what you're going to be doing in the cloud and when, and what sort of latency you could put up with. Not everybody is necessarily running, not every customer is running an infrastructure that needs like millisecond, latency into the cloud. Imagine, I don't know, let's say a legal office. Maybe you as an MSP are in a remote area, you're managing a legal office of 10 lawyers, administrative assistants or paralegals. And what are they really doing? They're basically typing, they're loading briefs, they're doing things like that, and they're using the cloud for backup. And they don't necessarily need that document to be pulled down in milliseconds, but as long as it works and they don't notice the kind of latency that makes it annoying to work, most people are typically pretty good. Now, there are applications where you need to ensure and run the tests to make sure that your business is not going to sort of collapse because you may be in a bandwidth constrained area. But I would say, George, of every 100 MSPs that we work with, the bandwidth question might come up 1 or 2 times.
Is there some sort of way to calculate whether the MSP needs to bump up the juice? Like, is there a tool?
Yeah, there are tools. There are tools. Our technical team has all kinds of tools that they run to see sort of what the bandwidth is. And even in our cost estimator, we will help you calculate the typical cost for bandwidth even. So you know how much you're going to spend on the data that is leaving the Azure data center. Because you actually don't pay for data going into the Azure data center, you pay for data coming out. So you don't pay for ingress, you pay for egress. And we will help you even calculate the costs of pulling that data out of the Azure. The good thing also I'd say is that, Microsoft continues, you talked about other clouds. Microsoft has more regions than the other 2 clouds combined, the other 2 public clouds combined. So chances are, no matter where you're listening to this webinar, to this podcast from, Microsoft either has multiple data center regions or is getting ready to build one. I think a few weeks ago, they just announced they're opening up in Poland. So Poland's going to have an Azure data center. Italy's going to have a new one. So that also helps when it comes to latency and things like that for MSPs.
So talking about regions is actually my next topic. Just spinning up a virtual machine in Azure doesn't mean that you automatically, and maybe Nerdio does this, but it doesn't mean that you automatically have redundancy between data centers. It doesn't mean that you have backup turned on immediately. It doesn't mean that encryption's turned on immediately. These things have to be added and thought about, right, as part of the pricing mechanism.
Great news. We have thought about all that. So what happens is when you go through the process of deploying Nerdio, we ask you some basic questions. For example, do you want to do in-region backup, meaning backing up your customer's data within the same region 9 times? Do you want to do out of region DR? So maybe you are, let's say, in the West US data center, and you want, just from a disaster recovery standpoint, you want to back up all your data into the East US data center. So we ask you a bunch of those questions, and we make it easy for the deployment to happen with those things to be thought of. So again, we sort of take you through a wizard approach. We've done, many thousands of deployments and really have taken a lot of this into consideration.
I always cringe when I hear, "Oh yeah, I put it in Azure or I put it in one of the clouds and I pay $5 a month." And I'm like, $5 a month?
Yeah,
This is running on fumes at $5 a month.
right. We get, we've seen people in the industry, George, who have solutions like we're talking about today, or try to build something like what we've built. And what they do is they architect the solution with the minimum virtual machines. And that's sort of like the what do they call it in the grocery? Like the loss. I don't even want to say the loss leader, because what ends up happening is you say, "Oh wow, that looks amazing. Wow, I could put my customer into the cloud for $22 a month." And then you realize that the VMs are under spec'd. They don't quite work the way they should. The domain controller doesn't have a good enough series virtual machine in it. We take the experience that we've had doing thousands of these deployments with our partners, and we make sure that when we're doing the architecture, we show you this is really the minimum that you need to have to make sure that the system is going to run properly. A great example, a lot of people, particularly in this day and age, when more and more people have to work from home, we've gotten a lot of requests from people who are graphics intensive users, right? Architecture firms, are the biggest ones, graphic design firms, and they have this idea in their mind that they can't run their business in Azure. They say, well, it's impossible. I've tried. I've gone to Azure and I've used these virtual machines and it's incredibly slow. Well, it's probably because you're not using the right series. Microsoft has a virtual machine family called the NV series, which is NVIDIA optimized GPU intensive virtual machines that were designed specifically for this type of scenario where people have graphics intensive work. Now they cost more. They do cost more, right, than a regular, let's say, B series virtual machine, which is one of the least expensive ones. But a lot of it, George, comes down to speccing it out the right way, which Nerdio helps with, and being willing to believe that Azure can handle even the most demanding workload.
How do you because there is multiple options, of course. We talk, as we go through this webinar, more and more options pop up. How do you figure out whether you can get away with shared space or whether you can go to a dedicated machine, right, within Azure?
I have to say, George, if you ever want to merge bVoIP and Nerdio so you could be on our team selling this, you do a great job of explaining it all. So we're going to have to talk about that separately, but you're a great salesperson. You know all the questions to ask. Microsoft recently released a new product that I think you mentioned earlier called Windows Virtual Desktop. And it's the latest innovation in Azure that's really taking the MSP market by storm. And we could talk more about what Windows Virtual Desktop is, but briefly, when people ask me, what is it? I always say it allows your customer to stream a Windows 10 desktop from Azure. That's what it is. They can stream.
This has probably been the popular thing now with the last couple months, right?
Unbelievable. Everyone wants to know about WVD, Windows Virtual Desktop. Now in WVD, Microsoft has two concepts. They have a concept called pooled desktops, and they have a concept called personal desktops, right? And a lot of times people, I don't want to say make the mistake, but they approach it saying, I need a one-to-one assignment. I need every user to have their own personal desktop. What is a personal desktop? It's a one-to-one virtual machine to user assignment. It is definitely a more expensive way of doing it. And a lot of times MSPs will have tried to architect an Azure solution doing personal desktops for every user. And they say, well, wow, my God, this is so expensive. What just happened? Until we show them that pooled desktops actually work really well. And within our tool, we've thought of that as well. When you're doing the deployment and you're planning out your architecture, we even ask you, what kind of customer is this? Are these task workers? Are they professional workers? Are they executives? And then we can really map the user to CPU core ratio. We could kind of suggest to you how many people should be on a pool, because quite frankly, the overwhelming majority of companies we work with end up doing pooled users for the majority of the users that they're standing up in virtual desktops. And then you might see, an executive like George getting his own personal VM because he needs to make sure to always have, the capacity, the space, reduced, chance for others to be sharing it at the same time. So, but I would say the greater majority are using pooled desktops and shared resources.
So what is the cost benefit analysis? Or let me make that easier. Why would I go WVD, Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure versus a terminal server?
Well, the way I'd answer that, George, is when Microsoft came out and was planning Windows Virtual Desktop, they were trying to overcome, I'd say, two major issues with this whole world of virtual desktops. Issue one was the product itself. So if you wanted to spin up a virtual desktop pre-October 2019, so it seems like 5 years ago, but it was actually, not that long ago, right? If you wanted to do it pre-October 2019 with the old RDS VDI model, you were really using a Windows server with a desktop experience skinned on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
You were not using true Windows client to do that. So the first enhancement Microsoft made was saying, okay, we are going to enable Windows 10, which by the way is now being used by over 1 billion people in the world. So we're going to have Windows 10 be a multi-user operating system. So number one, the technology is there. Number two, the awareness is there, because if 1 billion people are using it, I think most people would prefer to use the desktop operating system that they know and that they like, Windows 10, to be able to stream their desktop from the cloud. The second thing they did, and the second reason people are excited about this, is they made the licensing a lot easier as well. So from a licensing perspective, in the old days, pre-October 2019, you had to license Windows, if you're an MSP and you wanted to do this, you had to license Windows Server, let's say 2016 or whatever it was. You had to license RDS CALs, right? You had to license something called the shared computer activation. So you had all these pieces that you kind of had to put together like a little bit of a Lego. So you'd call your cloud distributor and you're like, yep, I need Windows Server 2016. I need this, I need this, I need this. And you're putting it all together. Now, what do you need? All you need is you need either Windows 10 Enterprise or the new Microsoft 365 Business SKU. If you have one of those, you have what's called an entitlement to run Windows Virtual Desktop in the Azure cloud. So much, much, much easier from a licensing perspective, much simpler, less friction. And I think I would tell you just a data point, George. If we look at the deployments that we've seen on Nerdio over the past 3 months, as the pandemic was sort of ramping up and hitting at the beginning of March, I would say, I think we saw yesterday, it's like 93% of the deployments are Windows Virtual Desktop and not the old RDS model.
So what does the end user see, right? And remote desktop, you get that little RDP icon you can click on and sign in. Like, is this a browser? Is this an application that gets installed? How do printers work? Like, I'm trying to match it up.
So all that's taken care of. They basically click on an icon on their desktop. It launches what looks like a Windows 10 desktop. We've seen a lot of companies, as you can imagine. I'll give you one example, George. We got a call from a company, I won't say the name, but I'll give you the sense of it. This is a toll road operator, right? So imagine a big city with a toll road. It's privately owned, and they had a call center, right? So the call center, imagine they had 200 call center agents sitting in a building in this state, and they are answering the phones. They're answering questions from people calling in to dispute their bill, to ask for the right, sorry, I'm just going to close my window because the motorcycle man's coming back, to dispute their bill, to ask questions, to say, no, that wasn't me that you caught not paying the bill, all these things. COVID hits, and now all of a sudden, none of them can work at the call center anymore. But they have their desktops that were sitting on their desk. Those were kind of old desktops, actually. So what did we do? We enabled them through Nerdio, through an MSP, with Windows Virtual Desktop. Now they were able to go home, use an existing device that they had, let's say a laptop, maybe their home laptop. They couldn't pick up the desktop and take it off their desk and bring it home, but they could use any device. They could give them a zero client, a thin client to take home, a Chromebook, an existing laptop, a desktop they have at home. They install and they put out an icon on everyone's desktop. They launch it. It looks like they're sitting in front of their Windows 10 desktop with their files and folders and Active Directory and their application that they are using to manage their toll road operations, sitting in their kitchen or sitting in their bedroom. And that's really been the scenario that we've seen, George, really take the MSP market by storm over the past 3 months. I think people were very interested in Windows Virtual Desktop, but now it's become much more of a necessity than anything else, at least as an MSP, to look into it. If you were looking into it before, that's great. If you were not looking into it, it's hard to imagine an MSP practice kind of moving on without at least understanding how Windows Virtual Desktop, how the cloud in general, how
Fair.
Azure can help you.
No, it's fair. It's fair. So, what do you tell the guy who says, "Hey, I have an RMM. I've nailed Microsoft Active Directory for years. I got this thing down to a science, but Azure Active Directory is not equal." What do you tell that guy?
What we tell them, quite frankly, is that you could stay where you are. I mean, we're pretty matter of fact about it. You could stay where you are. You could stay on premises. But I think you're ultimately going to be uncompetitive in the MSP space if you stay on premises too long. There are all kinds of white papers and explanations about Azure Active Directory and being able to link your on-premises Active Directory into the cloud. And quite frankly, I'd say, the MSPs that we work with have not seen any performance degradation. In fact, they've seen their practice enhanced by adopting Azure. So, we sort of take it from a much higher level and we say, of course, there are many people who are on premises today and you could stay there, but your peer down the road is probably thinking about moving to the cloud. And if you're not, you're likely going to be uncompetitive. Similar to the example you gave before, George, how many people are still running Exchange servers on premises? Is that really the way to do it anymore? I hope not, right? But if someone is, and they say, well, I know how to manage my Exchange server, I've done it for many years. Well, that's good, and that's true. But there is a new way to do it, and there's a better way to do it, and it's time to move to the cloud.
Okay, so talk to me about the experience then, right? Because there's been Microsoft's, specifically, and other vendors, but specifically have tried to enforce, multi-factor authentication across the board and trying to up everybody's security situation. How does that now play when you're in this, first hybrided mode, right? Still on premise, kind of Azure, and then migrating totally to the cloud. What's the expectation moving forward there?
Well, certainly it's fair to say, George, that there's no MSP you speak to today, no event that you and I attend together. Hopefully, God willing, those will come back one day too.
I hope so, yeah.
No event where you don't see a plethora of security vendors there. And I think it's because it's the top of mind issue for every MSP. You could almost not buy too much security. So certainly from a multi-factor authentication perspective, we take that into account at Nerdio. And we probably won't go into a deep dive on that now, but we could definitely get Tony on to go through the intricacies of how we handle MFA. But it is a question that comes up a lot. Actually, one of the questions that comes up a lot, George, is MSPs say, well, I don't think the cloud is secure. I don't really understand, why I should believe in the cloud. One thing I remember from Microsoft when I was there is I think when I departed, I was at a session about a week before where I was talking with a woman, Ann Johnson, who's the corporate vice president of cybersecurity. And she was quoting a fact that Microsoft now has, I think, over 10,000 engineers working on Azure security. So Azure is an incredibly secure platform to build your business on. And it's well complemented by many of the other vendors who are in the space who do things beyond what Azure does, some of the dark web monitoring, filtering products, and things like that. So I think it's a and as opposed to an or when you think about moving to the cloud.
Okay, so should MSPs who are investigating Azure as a cloud model also be looking at other solutions to complement it? Like, where does Microsoft tell you, hey, you ought to consider looking at third parties for this, or that?
Yeah, I haven't seen their latest list, George, but there's certainly areas that Microsoft does not get involved in, as far as I know. A good one is like the ID agent stuff, the dark web stuff, the Huntress stuff. At least for now, Microsoft doesn't really involve themselves too much in that. So I definitely think that there's a lot of room for companies like that to continue to be successful and will continue to be successful in the cloud space. I'm less certain, this is Joseph's opinion, this is not Microsoft or anyone else, I'm less certain about all the shows I go to where I see numerous email filtering platforms. I'm not totally sure about that. I sort of feel like Microsoft 365 does a pretty good job on filtering. I mean, we're a Microsoft 365 shop. I can't say that 100% of the spam is filtered out, but I feel like they do a pretty good job of the malware and the spam and all the various, malicious signatures that you get. But certainly in these areas that ID Agent, Huntress, and others play, I think it's a good investment for MSPs to make.
Like what about things like Duo, or what about things like third-party backup solutions, or do I still continue to use my RMM?
I think you do continue to use your RMM. I'm very mixed on backup, George. I'll tell you why. Because I think that Azure backup with locally redundant storage, zone redundant storage, geo redundant storage, I don't know why you would need something else. Now, there does come into the equation a kind of peace of mind that people have looking at this little box that's in front of you that you're saying, well, all the data is going to this little box and it's being backed up. And I sort of intellectually understand or emotionally understand why people get excited about that. They get less excited when the hurricane comes through and swamps that device. But I'm a believer that in the backup space, I don't know why people are paying huge amounts of money for incremental backup when they can, if they're in Azure already and they can make use of the power of the hyperscale cloud that Microsoft has. There's almost nothing Microsoft can't do from a backup space.
Okay, so you've made your feelings very clear on backup.
RMM, PSA, I think that's something that will continue for a while. I think that's something that we work very well with. We certainly through our relationship with Pax8, we integrate natively from their marketplace to the various RMM and PSA agents. I think there's a great world for that as well, and that will continue. But I think, again, this is Joseph's speculation more than fact. I think many of these companies that you and I both know well that have the big sort of RMM PSA solutions are all thinking through what their cloud play is, what their Azure play is. And the interesting thing is that I don't know that they're thinking through it only from the technology standpoint. I think they're thinking through it from a customer acquisition standpoint, because they're seeing more and more MSPs want to move to the cloud, and they ask themselves, well, what is my play there? Am I going to let all these customers transact through other cloud distributors, or am I going to have a play there? And well, we'll see how that plays itself out.
What's your opinion on the effectiveness of Microsoft Intune versus the RMMs that we've been using for?
I don't have a good perspective on that, George. It's a good question. We have MSPs that bring it up. I think Intune is a powerful product, but I don't know in the MSP space that it is yet swamping RMMs. It's very interesting, George. I mean, again, you and I go to these events all the time, and this is not a knock on my former employer because we work very closely with them, but how many times do you see Microsoft at these shows?
Once.
Talking about Microsoft Intune, right? Talking about security. And we certainly, I would say at Nerdio, we've tried to pick up the baton and run with it when it comes to Azure. I think we do a great job partnering with Microsoft, particularly their small and medium business team, to carry the Azure message on their behalf. But I think if Microsoft wants to see Intune become more popular in the MSP space, they're going to have to start evangelizing it a little bit more in the MSP space, and then people might see it as a reasonable alternative to what else is out there.
How do you make all of this happen and keep your billing under control?
Right. So it goes back to what we said, George, around creating a fixed cost model, a fixed cost package from a variable cost model. Mm-hmm. So Microsoft has some very interesting programs. If you think about Azure, what is it that you are renting from Azure? There's really two meters that are spinning. There's a compute meter and there's an operating system meter. So when you want to engage in Azure, those two meters are spinning. And just like the electricity in your home, the more your lights are on, the higher your bill is going to be. It's the same thing in Azure. The faster those meters spin, the higher your Azure bill is going to be. So your goal as an MSP is to either stop those meters from spinning or make them spin very slow while still creating a great experience for your customer. So Microsoft has these different programs, I'd call them licensing programs, one that you mentioned earlier, that allow you as an MSP to really get those costs under control and create really a fixed cost package. The first is something you mentioned earlier called Azure reservations or Azure reserved instances. The idea being that's what stops the compute meter from spinning, because you go to your cloud distributor, you say, I want to make a reservation on either 1 year or 3 years of this amount of compute. And in return for doing that, Microsoft gives you up to a 57% discount off of the list price of Azure. The second program they have is something called Azure Hybrid Benefit, where they allow you to take the Windows Server cores that you have purchased in a previous licensing program for Microsoft and bring those cores to the cloud. So now you don't need to rent Windows Server from Azure. So if you take advantage of those two programs, plus a few other things, you can now put so much margin into your Azure deployment that you could essentially gate your deployment, your customer's deployment, and not be worried that there's going to be this runaway train that's going to exceed the compute, exceed the storage costs that you need to pay for. And that's how MSPs are able to do it. The other way they do it, by the way, is they use an automation platform like Nerdio to implement a technology called auto-scaling. So we've implemented auto-scaling into our product. What auto-scaling does is it allows you to set the parameters of virtual machines to turn off and then turn back on when they need to be used. So imagine, again, a doctor's office, all the doctors and assistants go home at 6 p.m. You probably don't need the Azure resources to run after 6 p.m. So the system will scale down. So we see MSPs who follow our guidance there and use our technology, they save up to 80% off of the list cost of Azure, the list price of Azure. And as a result, they're able to confidently go to their customer and, again, put their margin on top of it, put their managed services on top of it, quote them a price and say, this is what it's going to cost you, and not have to change it month in and month out because consumption fluctuates a little bit. I think there was someone in the Q&A before was asking, sort of what's the typical margin that someone gets. We typically see MSPs on the low end get probably 60 points of margin for an Azure deal. And we've even seen as high as 100, 110, 120 points of margin. So it's quite a profitable thing. But to do that, you have to leverage these margin optimizations, these cost optimization strategies like reservations, like Azure Hybrid Benefit that we talked about.
Interesting. So, a lot of MSPs out there have dollars that are allocated to them, right? Like maybe even as something like Action Pack or something, right? Where they pay for their internal use stuff.
Yeah.
What would you suggest they should do with that? Like, how do you put your toe in the water and get started?
Step one is use your credits, use whatever you have from Microsoft to spin up a trial. We actually have a free 30-day trial on our website at getnerdio.com. We have a free 30-day trial of our product. We also, by the way, have a free trial of our cost estimator. Use your credits, use whatever you have for Microsoft to just get up and running. A great saying, a great learning I had when I was at Microsoft from a guy named Terry Myerson, who was a great leader at Microsoft, said you have to win somewhere before you win everywhere. You're not going to build your Azure practice overnight. You're going to start by bringing your first customer to Azure, learning how to do it and get up and running that way. And once you've mastered it, then you'll bring your second, your third, your fourth, and many more. The other thing I would tell you is that you should really pay attention, and Tony Kai and our team does a great job of this. Pay attention to the offers that Microsoft has. Microsoft rolls out a ton of offers every month that MSPs could take advantage of through what they call their CSP program, their Cloud Solution Provider program. For example, they have a program called Azure Everywhere or Azure Adoption, where they will pay the MSP $1,500 a day to deploy a customer into Azure. So wow, you just sort of paid for your maybe your engineer's time or one of your engineers' time for a couple of days to do that. They've got many programs like this, and the smart MSPs are the ones who pay attention to Microsoft's prescriptive guidance, who pay attention to the different offers, take advantage of them, And that's how they get going, building their cloud practice in Microsoft Azure.
Where are these offers posted? Is there a page?
There is partner.microsoft.com. So most MSPs who are at least an MPN partner, a silver partner, a gold partner, can go onto the partner site, partner.microsoft.com, and they'll see all the different offers that are available to them. And I believe Microsoft actually hosts a monthly webinar conference call where they actually go through the changes to the program.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So from a zoom out, perspective, how does M365 or Office 365 and Azure kind of like jam together, right? Because if you have M365 at some level, you already have some bits and pieces in Azure that you can parlay, no?
You do. When you use Nerdio, we require that you use Microsoft 365, or what we used to call Office 365, because it has within it the Azure Active Directory component that you need to ensure the identity in Azure. It's interesting, George, we were talking earlier again about, I like bringing up the Exchange server example, and you were talking about other clouds. I mean, there's other clouds out there. You could use AWS, you could use GCP. I even saw one company use Oracle Cloud, although I think it was the only one I ever heard of. But people say, why Azure for an MSP? Why not one of these other clouds? And it's very interesting when you go to different shows and you talk to MSPs, we rarely hear of MSPs using AWS and GCP who are calling on SMB. Why is that? Because 85% of them are already using Microsoft 365. They've already taken that leap to the cloud with Microsoft. In addition to that, probably 95, if not more, percent of MSPs are Microsoft partners. They at least have their MPN. Many of them are silver partners, many are gold partners. So to kind of, make it easy for you to transition from one cloud and now use a second cloud for Microsoft, much easier than, saying, okay, I'm a Microsoft 365 user, I'm a Microsoft partner, but I'm going to start fiddling around in AWS and learn their whole language and their whole partner program and their whole way of doing things. I'm not saying people don't do it. People do it for sure. But I think the overwhelming number of MSPs that you and I talk to would like to stay in the Microsoft ecosystem as much as possible. And that's one reason why at least they begin their exploration with Azure.
So it's not all sunshine and rainbows, Joe. Microsoft has had a couple of bumps in the road, right?
Yes, for sure.
There have been some outages to 365, to Azure, to Teams. How do you protect against that?
Well, I would say, George, that outages in the cloud world are unfortunately sort of a cost of doing business. And I don't mean to sound flippant saying that. They are. I would say that when it comes to Azure, and I'd probably say the same thing about AWS or GCP, I think the outages are few and far between. I don't think that they're certainly painful when they happen. People are calling us like, what's going on? We don't understand. Typically, they're resolved pretty quickly. But in a cloud world, it is a little bit the cost of doing business, but that still should not scare people away, because you could have problems with an on-premises server just like you could have an outage in the cloud. You will get called at your MSP to get in your car and travel out to the customer to try to help fix something for the same reasons, right? But if you think about, you as an MSP, how many outages, how many minutes of outage are you really going to see in a typical year for each of your small business customers because you're using Azure? I don't believe it's a reason not to choose the public cloud at this stage.
Does the multi-region redundancy help that conversation at all?
It certainly could help. It could help first from the standpoint of backup. So if God forbid something happened and you lost data from one region, if there was a disaster at one region, which really hasn't happened that much yet, or very, very, very infrequently. I think, maybe there was a hurricane in the South Central US and it went offline last year. Knowing that your data is somewhere else probably lets you sleep a little better at night. And then also, depending on the resources you're running, if you're able to fail over into another region, it may not be your preferred region, but at least you'll be able to ensure that the business continuity and that your customer continues to remain up and running.
Fair enough. So last, kind of as we get into the final stretch here, are there mandated requirements in order for MSPs to start going down this road? Are they forced into having to get certain certifications to get access, or how does that work?
I wouldn't say so, George. I don't think there's any requirements. A lot of people say that in addition to not understanding the pricing of Azure. Another reason they don't move to Azure is because they don't have anyone on staff who understands Azure. And they're afraid that they have to go hire an expensive Azure resource to be able to do that. And in truth, that's where Nerdio comes in. We allow you to deploy a complete IT environment in Azure in just a few hours without the need for an expensive Azure engineer. Now, if you have people in your practice, your technical bench, that want to go out and study for the Azure 900 fundamentals exam, study for the 103, that's an unbelievable thing, because you can only benefit as an MSP from having more people who know Azure and understand how to architect and manage a solution in Azure. So I always say all learning is great, and the more skilled your people are, the better your practice is going to be, the better it's going to grow. But there's no absolute requirement, certainly, to start working with Nerdio, other than to be using Microsoft 365 already, because then you'll be able to take advantage of Azure Active Directory and begin using our product.
Here's the $1 million question.
Okay.
How does support work? Because 1-800-Microsoft, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, we have tier 1 support for our product. We started, George, 15 years ago as an MSP. I wasn't at the company back then, so I can't take any credit. But our founder, Vadim, started his own MSP. So we have MSP in our DNA, in our blood, and we understand that you cannot be a successful SaaS company without amazing support. So we've invested a tremendous amount in supporting our product, not just post-sale support, but even pre-sales engineering. We've created a new team called Go Live Engineers. So if you're an MSP listening to this and you say to yourself, I'd like to do this, but I'm still a little bit nervous, I need a hand-holding, we will assign you a Go Live engineer to look over your shoulder as you're doing the deployment. We'll stay up with you on Friday night at 11 p.m. and do it with you when your customer is offline. We'll help you be successful so that the second time you do it, the third time you do it, you'll know how to do it. So I would say from a pre and a post-sales support, we believe we have one of the best in the industry, certainly the best in the industry when it comes to Azure. And I think if we have any fault, it's that people call us for all Azure related questions.
That's what I was concerned about. So like what happens when Microsoft's actually having a problem, or what happens if they actually need assistance from that side?
Yeah,
they get that through you, or how does that work?
We always start with the default of trying to help our partners be successful. So people call us all the time, and it turns out to be an Azure issue, and they may need to open a case, they may need to research something. We've built up a really good knowledge base to help our partners be successful. And we even broadcast out if there's an outage, if there's something going on, so that partners could be aware of that. But yeah, a lot of people come to us, because we've sort of touted ourselves as we're the definitive Azure solution for MSPs. So we tend to get a lot of questions about Azure and of course about Nerdio, and we're happy to try to answer them or point you in the right direction to answer them.
Fair enough. So how do people watching this engage, right? Where do they go to connect? I'm sure they're not calling you directly.
They can if they want. We're all about partner success. So a couple ways. First thing I'd say, check out our website, getnerdio.com. And on our website, you could contact us there. You could spin up a free trial. You could check out our cost estimator. And we created something called the Nerdio Academy, which is about 700 curated articles, technical, non-technical, videos, podcasts, webinars, everything you need to build a successful cloud practice in Azure. You can visit us on our website and check that out. If you want to get in touch with me, Jay Landes, JLANDES at getnerdio.com, and I would be happy to point you in the right direction as well, Jay Landes. And love to chat with you and love to help anyone listening to this build a successful cloud practice in Azure.
Here's one question that came through. I want to make sure we didn't miss him. So Scott asks, how do you deal with a customer that needs access to super bandwidth intensive local resources, like maybe security cameras constantly streaming and having to be recorded?
Yeah, good question. Probably better to ping me separately and we can answer that because it'll probably be a little bit more involved. But good question, Scott. Jay Landes at getnerdio.com.
Okay, fair enough. At least he didn't leave you hanging. He's going to help you out. So that's good. Well, I appreciate you, Joe, for taking a little bit of time out of your day. I appreciate everyone for jumping online and watching us on the various resources here. So, at the end of the day, it sounds like the prevailing thought out of all of this is, one, it's not as scary as it looks.
Right.
Two, there is a way to factor your costs so that you're not like guessing if you're making money that month or not.
Right.
Three, there's some automation that's available to actually do this right, rather than you trying to lowball this and get the, oh, it's so cheap, how can, $5 a month thing, right? Like, that's not for real. It needs to be done right in order for you to like not fall down, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, make it easier and faster.
And then the other realities are, if you're a Microsoft partner, have at least Action Pack, there are dollars there sitting there waiting to be used that you could actually get started with at no additional cost. And if you're already in Office 365 or Microsoft 365, whichever you prefer, you're already part of the way there.
A big part of the way there. No question about it. That's a great summary, George.
Okay. What else did I miss? Any other nuggets?
That was one of the most comprehensive webinars that I've done in a long time. So thank you for being such an expert in our space. If I was interviewing you about VoIP, I'd be much less fluent, so I'd have to study up a little bit. But when I heard about the MSP initiative, I knew it was something I wanted to get in touch with. So big thanks to you for having me. Big thanks to Sade and to everybody else in the organization. And big thanks to everyone who listened today. We're happy to help you. Jay Landis at getnerdio.com. Happy to answer all your questions.
Everyone, we look forward to seeing you on Thursday, 1 o'clock Eastern, for the next session of the MSP Initiative. All of these videos are recorded, so for anyone that asked, these will be posted very, very shortly after the session. You can play them back over and over and over again, free of cost. And our goal is to make sure that we're serving you. So if there are topics that you want to hear about, let us know so we can bring smart people like Joe and other people from around the industry online to get you the information that you're looking for. Thanks again for coming online, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.